About a year ago, right after Thanksgiving, I uploaded this video about Bless the Martyr and Kiss the Child by Norma Jean. And it was kind of scary because it was like my first real YouTube video. Like my hair was all kind of weird, which I guess hasn't really changed that much. And I was wearing these glasses that had these shiny reflections all over them from the lights and from my computer screen. And I'll be honest, it was kind of a mess. But because it was such a mess, it like really kind of stuck with me and became very memorable. And I'm kind of a sucker for tradition, so I decided I wanted to revisit that same era of the early 2000s, but maybe even go
earlier
to like 2001, when this brand new band, still wet behind the ears, decided that they were not just going to take that first and most difficult step towards legendary status, but instead literally threw themselves up that staircase. My name is Daniel Terry, and this is my deep dive into Throwing Myself by Luti Kriss. So, origin stories are always kind of funny to me, especially for these Christian-themed metalcore bands from the early 2000s. But the Luti Kriss origin story always stands out as unique to me. Because normally the story goes that a bunch of guys who go to church or youth group together all decided to form a band and dedicate their music to Christ. However, in this old as dirt interview that I dug up from 2001 with Daniel Davison, the drummer of Luti Kriss, the band actually existed before that lyrical theme back in the mid to late 90s. The story he told in that interview was basically that they were all just friends who started a band. And then one night, half of the band ended up attending a church service where there was an altar call, and they ended up dedicating their lives to Jesus. Then, the following week, they invite the rest of the band to church, and the rest of the band members end up dedicating their lives to Jesus as well. And it ended up being this mutual group decision to make Luti Kriss into a Christian metal band. And I'll put a link to that whole interview in the description of this video if you want to read it. It's actually pretty interesting. And after some time passed and the band had kind of unified under that central theme of Christianity, they started writing songs and playing shows. And in 1999, the band released a split CD with another Christian heavy band called Travail. And as a matter of fact, Travail's probably the only reason that I even know the name Luti Kriss to begin with. Because as a sidebar, I had Travail's album, Beautiful Loneliness, and there's a song on there called When I Fall, where he specifically calls out the name Luti Kriss and something about Myrtle Beach. I remember Myrtle Beach and all my boys in Ludacris. Which was really significant because I had no idea what he was talking about. But anyway, the songs that were on that split CD with Travail ended up becoming what is now commonly referred to as the 5 EP. And this is where the world got its first taste of Luti Kriss. Now, I'm not going to go through this one song by song, but it's definitely a really interesting look at the origins of a band who would not continue with their original sound. And on 5 EP, the band kind of knows that they want to be a heavy band. They know that they want to be unpredictable, and they try to achieve this with turntables, some moody clean vocals, and some high-pitched shrieks. And while I wouldn't call this the most compelling material that the band has ever released, it is fascinating to think about all of the different ways that this band's untapped potential could have gone. And of course, we already know the answer. This EP, as well as probably an uncountable amount of shows, eventually landed the band a deal with Solid State Records, which was pretty much the label you wanted to be on if you were going to get noticed in the Christian hardcore and metal scene. Because if you don't watch my channel, you may not know that between 1997 and 1999, Solid State had put out landmark releases from bands like Living Sacrifice, Embodiment, Spitfire, and Zao. And now, Luti Kriss was primed and ready to join that string of classic releases with Throwing Myself, right? Well, it's complicated, because this is where my history with this album differs from the historical context of this album, if you'll bear with me here. Not very many of us are lucky enough to be there on day one when something's released. I mean, most of the experience of being a music fan involves finding a band and then consuming what could possibly be a massive back catalog of albums. And it was no different for me with Luti Kriss, or really Norma Jean, as they were introduced to me first. As I discussed in last year's video, Norma Jean's Bless the Martyr and Kiss the Child absolutely set my brain on fire with its unrelenting chaos and unpredictable energy. Now, I was lucky enough to get that album whenever it was like the newest thing that the band had released, but as one does, I quickly discovered the band's past and that they had a different name and that they had a full-length album that I'd never heard of called Throwing Myself. See, this was back during a time when you could just go out and buy a copy of Throwing Myself from a Christian bookstore. And I remember getting the CD and unwrapping the shrink wrap and popping it into my CD player and anxiously listening to the entire thing in one sitting. And I really didn't like it very much. Now, before you click off the video, that isn't how I feel about Throwing Myself at the end of 2024, but there were some pretty specific reasons I had for why I didn't enjoy Throwing Myself at the time that I'll get into during my track-by-track breakdown. And that breakdown starts right now. Also, if you guys don't have the time or the energy to watch a full track-by-track breakdown, I totally get it, and that's why I put timestamps in the description of this video, so you can just skip right to my final thoughts and conclusion about the album. But for everybody else, let's dive in.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are the Luti Kriss from Atlanta, Georgia.
Throwing Myself starts off with this little minute-long intro track called Local 1145, which is a mixture of ambient noise, somebody talking indecipherably in the background with a bunch of radio chatter in the foreground. And there isn't really a whole lot to say about it other than the fact that it starts slow and brooding and then doesn't really go anywhere on its own. But it's absolutely effective in establishing a mood and an expectation for what you're going to hear on the rest of this album. The first proper song is called Blacksmith. And this song starts off like kind of slow and more atmospheric to the point where the vocals don't even kick in until like 20 seconds into the track. But once the vocals do kick in, you have a better general vibe for what this album is going to have on offer. Josh's higher-pitched shrieking and growling is very upfront in the mix. One of the first things you'll notice is that this album has a very loudly produced sound to it. Now, I'm not like an audio engineer, so I'm not going to be able to get into like all of the nuance of it, but all I can tell you is that this record is like mixed very loudly to the point where I think it's probably clipping in a couple of places. But musically, it has somewhat of a subdued and even more of a melodic vibe with this really intense screaming over it. And in the background, if you really listen close for it, there's some very muffled, clean singing. And from here, the song fluctuates between this moody riffing and some faster, more unpredictable moments that you would come to normally expect from this band. The song operates as more of like a slow burn or a build-up until it reaches its absolute resolution about 3 minutes into the song. And from there, the rest of the runtime is over a minute of the song sort of fading out with some like creepy atmospheric elements being peppered in for good measure. It's bizarre, and the first time I ever listened to this, it really wasn't what I was expecting to hear. The third track is called The Annihilation, and despite the 9-second build-up, this song actually goes for the throat a lot harder than Blacksmith did. The riffing and the screams on the song are intense, and you can feel the band's heavy reliance on big riffs and chugs all over this album. But what I like about Throwing Myself is that they kind of make you earn it. Like, you just had to listen to about 7 minutes of slower material to really get to this point. And I think the first time I heard Throwing Myself, that was the main source of my disappointment. Like, sure, it's heavy. Josh's screaming is cool. It's recognizable. His voice is iconic, but it didn't really have that punch you in the face kind of energy that Bless the Martyr and Kiss the Child had.
Where's the kaboom? There was supposed to be an earth-shattering kaboom.
For example, this is how Throwing Myself starts. And this is how Bless the Martyr, Kiss the Child starts. I think at the age that I heard Throwing Myself, I wasn't really looking for music that was going to like challenge me or demand a lot from me as a listener. But the rewards for actually doing so on this album are pretty tremendous, because right after the pick-me-up of The Annihilation, Light Blue Collar comes in like a freight train. And this song right here is exactly what I was wanting to hear on Throwing Myself when I was 16. Light Blue Collar is fast, heavy, chaotic, and dynamic. It's a full speed ahead rager. And it's funny too, because right after I bought this CD, I remember hearing this song all the time on satellite radio, only it was credited as Light Blue Collar by Norma Jean. And I guess it was just a way to keep the hype going, like maybe they were like in between singles from Bless the Martyr. I'm not sure what the deal was, but it was cool kind of getting introduced to the band's older material that way. Up next is the song Patiently Philadelphia. And this is where the album takes everything that it's shown us so far and dials up the creepiness factor by about 50%. The song starts off slower paced with Josh screeching over these clean vocals in the background that are mimicking every word that he says. The song continues on in this fashion until the 3-minute and 37-second mark, where the band shifts into a riff and screaming pattern that sounds like it could have been lifted from an outtake of Bless the Martyr, Kiss the Child. Most specifically, this song reminds me of that super long, pretty soon I don't know what, but something's gonna happen song from Bless the Martyr. And honestly, 100 Powell also feels that way in places, and also feels a bit like the song Sometimes It's Our Mistakes That Make for the Greatest Ideas. And it's an interesting relationship because I think parts of these songs make this album sound more like Bless the Martyr, but these same songs on Bless the Martyr remind me a lot of Throwing Myself. And back when I was first checking out this album, I remember being disappointed that it didn't sound exactly like Bless the Martyr, and yet the comparisons were staring me in the face the entire time.
How do you not get that?
I've always struggled a little bit with a lack of attention to detail, which compels me to try to make up for it by doing track-by-track deep dives of 20-year-old albums in my late 30s. An Act of My Own Volition is up next, and it starts off with just bass, drums, and screams, before going into the same type of hypnotic riffing that they've been using for the better part of this album. And what I love about this song, and a lot of the B-side of Throwing Myself, is how they focus on quick, intense bursts of energy before leveling themselves out again and repeating that for 4 or more minutes. This is another song where they come so close to hitting the same level of intensity as Bless the Martyr. And I'm sorry to sound like a broken record here, but I promise there's a reason I'm calling this out every single time I see it. The next song, Last Breath First, switches it up by starting off with some fairly chaotic riffing that soon gives way to actual, feel-good melodic riffing, and even some clean singing that isn't buried behind screams. And this song is all about alternating between chaos and beauty. And the biggest moment comes at 1 minute and 55 seconds, where they mix the melodic riffs with the intense screams. And this song always stood out to me on this album as having its own melodic identity, and the ending breakdown is also super strong. Catharsis is up next, and it's a little bit more of a meandering song, to the point where I'm not sure if it ever really figures out where it's going. It's a perfectly good but ultimately unspectacular song that sounds a little bit too much like what came before it. The next song, Petty Larson, on the other hand, completely changes things up in a good way. It starts off slow with a strong riff, kind of keeping all of the gloominess in check. However, the vocals are mostly clean sung, and the song sort of just builds and builds for almost 2 minutes before everything goes silent, and this bouncy, chaotic riff bubbles up to the surface, and the screams come back in. And the song ends much the same way it began, but with a lot more intensity. Up next, Foreshadows sort of combines a lot of the elements that we've already heard so far into one song. Lots of creepy talking and singing are kind of thrown in here behind these riffs that just sort of build and build and build into intense screaming. And it's a great moment on the album, and I think it serves as a great penultimate song. Now, before you hit the comments, I have not forgotten about the final song, A Chase in the Crowd. So full disclosure, the first time I ever listened to Throwing Myself, I thought Foreshadows was just the last song on the album. But if you listen past the track of silence and then about another minute and a half of silence, you get the obligatory Christian metal band does a soft song at the end of their album, which isn't exactly fair. It's a great song and it feels very emotional. And they do kick in the distortion in the middle and there's some screaming, but it's mostly a clean sung experience.
It was always 10 steps that you.
And I think back at that time, bands just felt like they needed to throw something more emotional at the end after spending an hour beating you in the face with screams and breakdowns. And an interesting note is that Throwing Myself was recently added back to streaming platforms, but for some reason, this song is completely omitted. And that sucks because I think this song adds quite a bit to the end of this album. It makes it feel very emotionally significant at the end.
This means something. This is important.
So without it, I think that the album is incomplete on streaming. So with that overview of the songs in mind, let's get into how I felt about Throwing Myself when I was a teenager. And most of that can be summed up in two statements. One, everything other than Light Blue Collar doesn't sound anything like Norma Jean, even though it's basically the same band. And number two, everything other than Light Blue Collar is really slow and doesn't seem to go anywhere. And by slow, I mean the majority of the songs are over 4 minutes long and the riffing is overly repetitive. Screams are cool, but that's about it. So point number one's easy. As we covered in the album breakdown, that statement is blatantly untrue. As a matter of fact, when I was listening to this album over and over again to do this video, and I was kind of taken aback by how much like Norma Jean this album actually sounds. And I have no idea how I wasn't able to hear it when I was younger. Sometimes I kind of struggle with things that are not clearly spelled out for me. And if I had to guess what my problem was back then, it's that I didn't like how compressed and produced Josh's vocals are on this record. I feel like a lot of the dynamics of his voice are cut out, whereas on Bless the Martyr, the album was intentionally less produced overall. So I think that might have been my hang-up, but I just wouldn't have known how to describe it back then. Point number two, on the other hand, is a little bit more complicated because I think high school Dan only understood the world in terms of this sucks or this is awesome, which translates to this is my preference and this is not. But the downside of that is that there was no nuance, for things that I didn't understand or have any context for because, sure, everything other than Light Blue Collar is slower, and the riffs can be repetitive and meandering. But the issue that I was having back then was saying that like it was a bad thing. As I've gotten older, something that I've come to understand a bit better is the concept of diminishing returns. When I first got into heavy music, the goal was always for the next thing that I listened to be heavier than the last thing that I listened to. And somewhere during that journey, creative songwriting starts to kind of leave the picture. It's more of a game of how far can I go on this journey until I finally hit my limit on how much noise can still be considered musical. However, the thing about heaviness and speed and immediacy is that eventually you get numb to it. And you get numb to every other kind of music that doesn't have that same level of intensity. And I think ultimately that was exactly why I didn't appreciate the fact that Throwing Myself has its own unique sonic identity. It operates under the correct perspective that the payoff is more satisfying when you have to work for it, to build up steadily with an ever-increasing sense of anticipation.
The suspense is terrible. He's gonna go this time. I hope it'll last.
This record perfectly balances moodiness and anger with triumphant heaviness and melodic satisfaction. And while it may not provide the immediate adrenaline rush that later Norma Jean albums would provide, I find it more enjoyable 23 years later, specifically because it forces me to pay attention and take my time with it. And speaking of time, I've probably taken up enough of yours with this video. Let me know what you think of Throwing Myself in the comments. And I just wanted to take a second at the end of the video to thank everyone who has subscribed to this channel over the past year. The channel just passed 1,000 subscribers this month, and I'm floored at the amount of people who watch these videos. Thank you guys again so much. I'll see you soon.